All right. Hebrews chapter 8. Hebrews chapter 8. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, Hebrews chapters 7 through 9 is a discussion, is a lesson about how much greater the covenant we live under is than the old covenant was. And especially he's talked about the fact that Jesus is a greater high priest. Well, he continues that in chapter 8. All right? And he begins in the very first verse. Now, this is the main point of the things we're saying. We have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. This is the chief point. This is the main point. This is the essence of what he has just talked about in chapter 7. And the main point is that we have, talking about Christians in this age, we have a high priest. Our high priest is not on earth. He's not in an earthly sanctuary. He's not in an earthly temple, but rather he's in heaven. Another reason our covenant is so much better. He says this is the main point of what I've been trying to emphasize. Of course, the right hand is the place of the highest honor. I mean, if you were seated by the right hand of someone, you had the seat of the greatest honor. And so Jesus is right there by the right hand of God, showing He has great honor being there. And it says He's seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. Of the majesty in the heavens. Of course, majesty refers to things that are glorious and great and honorable and worthy of worship. And of course, He is in the heavens. Again, He is not on earth. Jesus is not on earth. He's not coming back to earth to do anything. He is in heaven, and He is, as He's going to mention in a few minutes, He's our mediator. He's our intercessor. He still does stuff for us every single day. He's not stopped. He doesn't have to offer His blood. He only had to do that once because that's how powerful it was. But He still mediates and intercedes for us on a daily basis. And He says He's a minister of the sanctuary. Verse 2, He's a minister of the sanctuary. In other words, He serves. He works for us in the sanctuary. Of course, the sanctuary is in heaven. That's where He's working for us. And so, it's not like Jesus sat down in heaven and never does anything. Quite the opposite. He continues to minister for us, serve us, mediate for us, and He never stops. Never stops. He continues to work for us. So even though His earthly ministry ended when He ascended, His heavenly ministry continues. So He finished His earthly ministry, and then when He ascended into heaven, His heavenly ministry began. So He still is a minister. He still serves for us. He still works for us. And so, while He was on earth, He was in human form, and so He fulfilled that I guess we would call that Levitical priesthood because He offered Himself. You know, the Levitical priest had to offer something. Well, Jesus offered the greatest thing He could offer, and that was Himself. He offered the greatest gift, the greatest offering, the greatest sacrifice, and that was Himself. Well, now that He's ascended into heaven, now He's fulfilling that priesthood of Melchizedek. Because remember, Melchizedek was priest and king. And that's what Jesus is in heaven right now. He's priest and king. He's our high priest. He's our king. He's the king of the kingdom. And so He's fulfilling that. And it says, of the true tabernacle which the Lord erected and not man. Of course, what did Jesus build? The church. He built the church. The church is not an earthly building. It's not an earthly temple. It's a spiritual one. Totally different. You know, so many religions in the world focus their faith on material things, on temples, on idols, on sanctuaries, on all of these things. Jesus is just the opposite. His kingdom, like He told Pilate, is not of this world. Because He said, if it were of this world, my servants would fight, but now my kingdom is not from here. He never had any plans to set up a kingdom on earth. That was not His plan. He had no plans to build a kingdom on earth. And even so-called evangelicals today talk about how Jesus is going to come back and replenish the earth and restore the earth, and this is where we're going to live, and He's going to build all these things for us here on earth. I was just reading a new book written by one of these evangelical authors, and the front cover, basically, which sums up the book, was about, we're not going to be in heaven, and the way he writes is that we wouldn't want to be in heaven anyway. Heaven's not going to be that great a place. He says we're going to be here on a restored earth where things are going to be great. I thought, where in the world did you get that? It didn't come from the Bible anywhere. Not even close. But that was the whole gist of his book. But see, so many people do that. They focus on physical, earthly, material things. And you just think about so many of the religions that do that. They focus on material, earthly things. Well, Jesus, He's a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle which the Lord erected. Jesus built it, not man. See, the church we're a part of, Jesus built Himself. Man didn't have anything to do with it. He's the one that built it. Remember, He said that in Matthew 16. Now, I'm going to build my church. The gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. So He built His church. All other churches were built by men. And He is not the high priest of those churches. He says He's the high priest of the one. He calls it the true tabernacle in this verse. The true tabernacle. The true church. The true kingdom. He's the high priest of it, and He's not the high priest of anything else. So it's the one Jesus built. Jesus built one true tabernacle, one true church, and no others. And of course He mentions that in a lot of places. He was even prophesied. Let's go back to Isaiah, the 2nd chapter. Isaiah chapter 2. Pages are sticking together. Yeah, would someone read verses 2 and 3? Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 and 3.
Now it will come about that in the last days the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. And many people will come and say, "Come, let us go up into the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that He may teach us concerning His ways, and that He may walk in His paths. And for the law will go forth from Zion."
It would go out from Zion, which is Jerusalem. And that's exactly where the church started. Started in Jerusalem. Where did the word of the Lord go from? It was Jerusalem. He calls it the mountain of the Lord's house. That's an expression for the church. It's going to be exalted above the hills and all kinds of people will go into it, all types of nations. You know, on Pentecost, there were lots of different nations there. And then, of course, it's kept spreading and spreading and spreading until where all different nations came into it. And so all the way back, 700 and some years before the birth of Christ, it was prophesied about this mountain of the Lord's house. All right. Well, back to verse 3 now in Hebrews 8. It says, "For every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. Therefore it's necessary that this one also have something to offer." Of course, the Levitical priest, part of their job was to offer gifts and sacrifices. And it was prescribed by the law of Moses what kind of sacrifices for this and what kind of sacrifices for that. And Jesus then, because He is a priest, He needed to offer something too. Well, what Jesus offered was Himself, because that was the greatest thing for Him to offer. Let's go back to the prior chapter, Hebrews 7, verse 27. Would someone read that for us? Hebrews 7, verse 27. Yes.
"Who needeth not daily as those high priests, to offer up sacrifice, first for his own sins, and then for the people's. For this he did once, when he offered up himself."
How many times did Jesus have to offer? One time. See, all those Levitical priests had to continue to offer over and over and over again. Jesus, one time. And that's all it took. That again shows how much greater He is than the Levitical priest. So, for if He were on earth, talking about Jesus, He would not be a priest, since there are priests who offer the gifts according to the law. I mean, we've already talked about the fact that Jesus could not have been a Levitical priest, because He wasn't of the tribe of Levi. He was of the tribe of Judah. People from the tribe of Judah could not be a Levitical priest. They weren't from the right tribe. So if Jesus were on earth, He could not be our priest. It would be impossible. But He's our priest in heaven. Again, showing how much greater He is, which is the point of the chapter. How much greater He is. So, He couldn't be a king on earth either. And this is, I think, a really valid point, because so many people think He's going to come back to earth and be a king. But if He can't be a priest on earth, He can't be a king either. We talked about that a couple weeks ago in our discussion about Melchizedek. So let's read Zechariah chapter 6. Let's go back toward the end of the Old Testament. Zechariah chapter 6. Let's see. Yeah, verse 13. Zechariah chapter 6, verse 13. Whenever you get there, if somebody would read that.
"Yes, He shall build the temple of the Lord. He shall bear the glory, and shall sit and rule on His throne. So He shall be a priest on His throne, and the council of peace shall be between them both."
Okay, notice He's going to be a priest on His throne. Well, He's just said that He can't be a priest on earth. Well, if He can't be a priest on earth, He can't be a king either. So all those people that believe He's going to come back and set up an earthly kingdom and rule from it need to read that verse. Because that verse says He is not going to come to earth. He's not going to be a priest on earth. He's not going to be a king on earth, because He's both. So if He can't be a priest on earth, which we just read about in Hebrews 9, then He can't be a king either. He cannot be those things on earth. It was never, ever part of God's plan for Christ to be a king on earth. He made that so plain when He was on earth, I don't know how anybody can misunderstand it. But He never, ever made that plan. He was going to be a king and rule from heaven. He was never going to rule on earth. Always from heaven. So, if He were on earth, He would not be a priest. All right? Jesus, when He offered His flesh and blood on the cross, the Bible says He only had to do that one time. So He's not continuing to offer His body and His blood in heaven. Well, first of all, heaven is not a place of flesh and blood. Couldn't anyway. So He is not offering Himself in heaven every day. The Bible said all He had to do was offer it one time. So He's not making offerings and sacrifices in heaven for us. He's our mediator. He's our intercessor. He's our go-between. He does not have to continue to offer over and over His flesh and blood. Once was all that was needed. So he again says He is not a priest on earth. He is a priest in heaven. He says the priest who offer the gifts according to the law, they serve the copy and shadow of the heavenly things, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle. For he said, "See that you make all things according to the pattern shown you on the mountain." Again, another reason that Jesus' priesthood is greater than Levitical. Notice what he says. The Levitical priest, they serve the copy and shadow of the heavenly things. A copy and a shadow. A shadow, as you know, doesn't have any material substance. It simply is, you might say, a reflection of the real thing. Remember, going all the way back to Hebrews chapter 2 and chapter 3, there were many Christians who were thinking about leaving Christianity and going back to Judaism. And one of the reasons this lesson, this book is written, is to convince people that would be going from something greater, Christian system, to something inferior. Why would you want to do that? If you have something greater, why would you ever want to give it up and take up something inferior? Well, he says that's the way it is with the New Covenant and the Old Covenant. The New Covenant is vastly superior. The Old Covenant, he said, was a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. So why would you want a copy and a shadow when you can have the real thing? That's what he's trying to get across. Why would you ever want that? So the priests and the offerings and all of that under the law of Moses, they were copies. They were shadows of what we get in the gospel system, what we receive, the reality of the gospel system. We are so much better off. He's going to talk about this in chapter 10 again, but right now he makes it clear. So a shadow doesn't have any substance. All it does is it's just evidence of the real thing. When a person is walking, their shadow is just evidence that there's a person there. Well, he says that's the way the law of Moses was. The law of Moses was the shadow. It's just a copy. It's just evidence of the real thing. See, we have the real thing. So when you have the real thing, which is better, which is greater, why would you want something inferior? So he's trying to convince them, don't go back to the law of Moses. Don't go back to the Old Covenant. There is nothing there for you. It is inferior. So don't go back to it. Now he does say when Moses was divinely instructed, which he was, when he was about to make the tabernacle, he was told to make it according to the pattern. Moses was given if you go back, especially to the book of Leviticus, but also in Exodus, Moses was given very specific instructions on how to build the tabernacle. Sizes, materials, how it was to be made inside, all the things that went in it. I mean, very, very specific. And Moses had to follow that pattern exactly. He couldn't deviate from it in any way. He was not given any authority to change anything. The size of it, the materials of it, the articles that went in it, he couldn't change a single thing. He had to follow it exactly. And so he says, but now he's obtained a more excellent ministry, inasmuch as he is also mediator of a better covenant, which was established on better promises. One of the things that we've already talked about this once, but I'll bring it up again. One of the things that Jesus is for us is He is the one that guarantees our promises. You know, God has made us promises in this age, in the gospel system. And Jesus, by His life, His death, His burial, His resurrection, His ascension, He's the one that guarantees that those promises will be kept. And that's what He does. And so Jesus now has obtained a more excellent ministry. It's better in every way. He's the mediator of it, and it's a better covenant because it has better promises. So it's better in every sense. The Old Covenant, a lot of the promises under the Old Covenant were physical ones. Like, if you follow my commands, I will make you prosper, the land will prosper, your cattle will prosper, and all these things. Your enemies won't be able to attack you. So a lot of the promises in the law of Moses were about physical, earthly things. Most of the promises we have in the gospel system are spiritual things. That makes them better because spiritual is better than physical. Heavenly is better than earthly. So they are better, much better blessings, much better promises than what they had. So they had promises, you know, that they would live certain times and they would have this and that. But ours are so much better. And so that's what he's talking about in verse 6. We have a better high priest, we have a better mediator, we have better promises, and therefore we have a better covenant. A better covenant. And that, of course, is what he's getting ready to talk about in the last part of the chapter. But I think that's probably where we'll stop. Because verse 7 all the way really through the end of the chapter is one main thought. Most of it's a quote from Jeremiah chapter 31. So hopefully you can read that before next week. And we'll, Lord willing, start with verse 7 next Sunday.